Thank you, Bruce, and also thank you to Nina Clark and to Karen Krull, who have been such wonderful co-workers in working on the events of this weekend, and to Kurt Peterson and all the volunteer army that he has working with the exhibition as well. Wit and Wood, Nordic Figure Carving is the title for this exhibition. A wood carver I knew travels a good bit in connection with his work. And when he travels to different communities, he enjoys trying to link up with fellow carvers wherever he goes. If he hears that, for example, that there's a class going on, he might stop by the school or the art center or the church basement, wherever the class is held, to see if there's a meeting going on, a carving club, carving show, class. He told me once that when he arrives at an unfamiliar building for the first time, he has a surefire system. Once inside the building, he looks for signs pointing the way to the public restroom, first of all, or he sniffs around until he detects the kitchen or a room where the smell of fresh coffee is coming from. And from there, all he has to do is look down at the floor and follow the wood chips down the hall. And there they are, the whittlers, the wood carvers. And if one is interested in looking not just down the hall, but back over one's shoulder, back in time, we can follow a trail of wood chips that leads from this place, the American Swedish Institute in Minneapolis, on this weekend, to a time and place a long time ago in a wooded peninsula far, far away. The love affair between Scandinavia and wood runs very deep. Woodwrights using axe and knife, giant gimlets and froes, produced large chips as they crafted logs of native oak and birch and pine into an elegant new style of boat that ruled the waves of the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean and the Baltic and the rivers of Russia for several hundred years. And when Christianity arrived on the scene about 1,000 years ago and began to crowd out the traditional gods and goddesses of the North, the new Christian places of worship, the wooden stave churches, offered up an aroma that combined the incense of the medieval Mass of Rome with the wonderful smell of freshly hewn and carved pine. The wood chips created by those church builders of the North fell from tools held by trained hands, hands that belonged to men who had probably served apprenticeships, perhaps down on the continent, where they learned the art of wood carving with gouges and chisels. But the majority of wood chips that fell on that rocky Nordic soil were made not by professionals, but by ordinary folks, the masses, the great unwashed, people who lived on farms in a cashless society, where you yourself made the things you needed for everyday life with a knife and an axe. A simple log building for people, as well as cruder buildings for animals. Tools and implements used for farm work. You carved the spoon used in courting rituals, and she then ate with that spoon. An itinerant wooden shoemaker traveled a circuit, going from farm to farm, perhaps once or twice a year, staying long enough to carve a new pair of wooden clogs for each member of the family, before leaving a trail of wood chips as he then moved on to the next farm. After the Nordic countries began to enjoy the new miracle food that finally reached its shores in the early 1700s, namely the potato, life and survival became less precarious. The nutrient-rich spud meant that more children survived. People lived longer. How wonderful to be able to live beyond the ripe old age of 40. And within a few generations, the population grew and then exploded. Farms in some areas that had supported 10 people in 1700 struggled to support 50 or more a mere 100 years later. Now there were more than enough hands to do the work. So as people continued the tradition of carving those same tools and rakes and harness parts and spoons and ale bowls, they could now take more time. They could work at a more leisurely pace, do finer work, take smaller, more refined cuts, produce smaller chips. They could decorate them more, embellish them, paint them, and onto the stage flows rosemalling and dalamoling, like we see around us in this room, and elaborately carved portals, not carved for churches this time around, but for doorways into the granary and farmhouses and horse barns. When commercial sawmills came along in the early 1800s to provide timbers and lumber for a voraciously hungry European continent experiencing the muscular growth of the Industrial Revolution, farmers in Dalarna, among other places, gladly heeded the call of lumber companies and headed off to the North Woods. Axe in hand, Mora knife in a sheath on his belt, Oscar or Arvid or Peter would cut down trees during January, February, and March, the coldest and snowiest months of the year, when it was easier to skid out the logs. But it got dark real early during those months, so they spent long evenings squeezed into cramped bunkhouses. And what did they do? They had the time. They were skilled with a Mora knife. They were surrounded with wood. Of course, they made wood chips. They whittled. Horses, among other things, playthings for the kids when they returned home in the spring. Herds of stylized horses that were prized not only by their children, but by grown-ups as well. Dala horses were off and running until they eventually became Sweden's informal national symbol. And some Nordic carvers began to whittle human caricatures as well. In the village of Döderhult, near Oskarshamn, a young guy named Axel Peterson began to whittle highly expressive minimalist likenesses of his teachers and the stern, portly parson. Many of his figures reflected his dry wit. Out of birch, and especially alder, he whittled the lives of the wretched poor, many of whom were desperate to immigrate to America, the promised land in the West. Peterson told stories in wood instead of words. And after illustrations of his work began to appear in newspapers and magazines throughout Europe and even in America, whittling figures in this Scandinavian style was hot. Some of these carvers were prolific. Some were even fairly well known. Others whittled their captivating characters for just their own amusement. Some sold their figures. Others gave them away as gifts. They were a varied lot. Some of the wood chips clung to immigrant trunks, and they made their way across the Atlantic from places like Mora in Dalarna to Mora, Minnesota, from Bergen in Norway to Bergen, North Dakota, to Decorah, to Lindström and Finland. The Scandinavian-style figure carving tradition flourished through the economically strapped 1930s. Once again, like a century earlier, people had plenty of time on their hands. but this time for a different reason. No jobs, no money. Making wood chips was inexpensive, and lots of folks found it wonderfully satisfying for creator and giver as well as receiver. The pile of wood chips shrank during the war years and in the post-war years in the Nordic countries as well as in North America. Why? There was war, of course, and maybe we just got too busy. We no longer had the time to simply sit around and whittle and carve. There was TV, after all. Or in some families and communities, a generation of two had passed since there were folks who even did tradition-based carving, or sloyd, or textile work anymore. No wood carver grandfather or uncle whose shoulder I could look over. But in the 1960s and 70s, something called Hansen's Law kicked in with full gusto in many Scandinavian American communities. A principle named after Norwegian immigrant and scholar Marcus Lee Hansen, who said the third generation tries to remember what the second generation tried to forget. Norwegianness and Swedishness was something to be recaptured and reclaimed. And since the language link back to the Nordic countries was broken for most people by this time, we chose instead to link up in other ways by embracing still living traditions that were non-language dependent, as in knitting and rosemalling and wood carving. Once again, piles of chips that grew larger and larger. Instructional courses began to appear, books, DVDs on both sides of the Atlantic. And the tradition continues. This exhibition, Wit in Wood, Nordic Figure Carving, celebrates some of the personalities as well as the many and varied features and aspects of the story I've just told. We see the work of some of the old masters, pieces from the collection here at the American Swedish Institute, from Vesterheim in Decorah, and from some private collections. We see two large herds of Dala horses, many decorated in ways that would make even Axel Peterson's stern teacher crack a smile. Skolemester Baronius, Schoolmaster Baronius. We see the masterpieces of Fred Cogelo and figures carved by the late Georg Brask, whose work was not been so widely known up until recently outside of Sweden, but whose inspiration is now generating wide interest among carvers in many corners of the world via the recent book, Whittling Little Folk. And finally, I'm delighted that this weekend features the work and the presence of a group of more than a dozen delightful, inspired, and inspiring students from Luther College in Decorah, who are enrolled in a January term course called Scandinavian Fine Handcraft. They've made lots of chips, that group sitting over there, these now seasoned whittlers and carvers. As of today, they've been wood carvers for exactly 17 days. None of them had whittled prior to January 3rd. One of them is studying art. The rest of them are studying biology, Spanish, environmental studies, nursing, accounting. But I have a hope and a hunch that there will be a pile of wood chips in their future as well. Even if they don't make their living with their carving, I hope they won't be able to live without it. I like to think of this exhibition as a large tent with room enough to embrace the work of 19th and 20th century masters those giants on whose shoulders we stand. It is a contemporary classic representational carver, whittlers, students, and young folks. It's they, after all, who hold the future of Sloyd, figure carving, spoon carving in their band-aided hands. Friends of Scandinavia and carving aficionados in general who thrive on that wonderful smell and trail of chips. The tent is big enough for us all. Welcome. Thanks for coming. I hope you enjoy this 3-month-long exhibition. Come again, tell your friends, and thank you. This is a chance if you have any questions. This is a...
Yeah, just raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you. And for those of you in the lower level, Nina will be taking notes and running them over here. So you can take questions from both rooms.
Ivor.
I have a question for the students. Has anyone of you cut your finger yet? You are now full-fledged wood carvers.
One of the giants on whose shoulders an awful lot of us in this room stand is Ivor, who stood up back there. Who began teaching carving classes here in 1987. Is that correct? Yeah. So there have been a lot of chips here too, thanks to Ivor. And to Bill, who is hiding back here, Bill Yeager. Yes?
So I have a question. Is it harder to make the first cut or to know when to stop?
I asked what was harder, to know where to make the first cut or to decide when to stop.
I think when one gets started, probably, am I right, that, I mean, you're closer to the starting date than I am. Is it not true that it probably is not knowing where to take that first cut? That's kind of scary. But then I think, yeah, knowing when to stop. There is, of Axel Petersen, I read in an article one time that was written shortly after his death in 1925, it said that he was a master at the difficult art of simplification. In other words, knowing when to stop. They're both tricky, where to start and when to stop. Yeah, that's a good question.
Harley, wit can be dark and it can be light. Can you tell us, out of the tradition, the carver that used wit the darkest, the most satiric, and the one that you find using it lighter?
I think no one would ever accuse Axel Petersen Döderhulten of sort of having meringue pie in the face sort of humor. It was pretty dark, and you sort of had to peek under to see if there was anything witty about that. I mean, I think that was sort of lemon twist witty, whereas I think some of the others are more slapstick. There's a wonderful piece from the Vesterheim collection by Bjarne Volde from southern Norway, who is a troll couple, and he had some ones that were just real belly laugh ones, like a not tiny woman carrying her very had too much to drink husband home. And she has a very sour look on her face, and he has a very contented smile on his, and with his head on her shoulder. So some, I think, were, yeah, there are any. In a way, I guess it's almost easier to do real slapstick, pie in the face, than it is maybe to to do the real dry stuff. But I think the wonderful photographs up here that are, to be able to see images 2 feet tall of some of the detail of the figures. Those are just some fabulous photographs that there's a lot of twinkles in the eye that show up in that bigger format.
I was just wondering 2 questions. What inspired you to start carving, and at what age?
Well, when I was just little, I did some sort of, I guess you could call it whittling, just sort of reducing the size of a stick and fooling around with a knife. And but I'll have to say that it was, and then I had an uncle who was a general woodworker, who was a Swedish-American handcrafter, and he was of enormous help to me. And he was the kind of guy who had no, he and my aunt had no children, and we lived not so very far away. So it was, when I would come there, he every single time would just drop whatever he was doing, and he was at my disposition to build things. So that's those seeds. I think any time wasted or invested in a child, those seeds aren't wasted. But as far as actual figure carving, I didn't really see much of that when I was a boy. But when I started to, as a college-age student, travel to Scandinavia and started to see figure carving there, because in the 1960s, and I was a member of the Augsburg College Choir when I was a student there, and that was sort of early years for group tourism, 1965, and so there were people that we saw, especially when we were singing in smaller communities, that would be selling figures, guys that were selling figures. And I realize now, what I didn't realize then, that what I was seeing there was just the very kind of tail end of a living tradition of people who were using it for supplementary, if not main income, after a devastated war economy that they were still crawling out of. And I didn't, that didn't dawn on me at the time. But that so inspired me, and I saw those figures. Not the sort of glorious knock your socks off church altars. They were, never once did I walk up to one of those and say, well, that sure looks easy, I think I could do that. But when I saw these little whittled figures, kind of the rougher the better, then it sort of thought, well, I could do that. I mean, I came home and took my dad's pocket knife and just started in. And it wasn't too long before I realized that it wasn't quite as easy as it looked, but it had been love at first sight, and it sort of bit me, and it never went away.
Do you see the tradition having changed over time, or is it idiosyncratic according to the carver?
I think that it is sometimes I've seen people get. I mean, we have a tendency, I think, in any handwork tradition. At least that's what I've seen. If it's textile work, or I've been at a lot of course centers, and regardless of what kind of handwork technique it is, it seems like the accumulation of tools is part of the fun. And so that's, in fact, I have a friend who has a pad of a notebook gummed together that he brings along to every class he takes, and it says, "Dear Dick's mom," and then it's a letter saying, "I, the teacher of blank," writes in the course, said that Dick needed to purchase this tool for the class, and then signs it at the bottom. I think that those are. So there, on the one hand, there has been so many more tools available that, having gotten away from just the mora knife and the axe, that tradition, as we've gotten more and more refined tools, it's easy and tempting to amass an arsenal of tools. And I did that. I kind of did that too. I mean, I added to my arsenal of tools, and then it sort of dawned on me one day, gee, I'm kind of straying away from what drew me to it in the first place. It was those great big flat facets that was done just with this one knife that I always carry at my belt, and that kind of drove me back to basics. So I think that any number of us that we too go through evolutions. So there's no question about there are more tools available now, but I think getting back to basics, I think I had a different title for this book, Whittling Little Folk, and the publisher, if this speaks to your question, the publisher kind of wanted to use a different name, and they wanted to go with Whittling Little Folk because they wanted the term whittling in there, because they said whittling is hot. And that's a book publisher. So they would, I guess, know better than I did. So I said, sure, that sounds like a fine idea. Yeah.
And I think there was a question on this side of the room somewhere, up here. So we'll take this one and then one more after.
Good timing. In order to become a good wood figure carver, would you say how much is raw art talent versus hard work and persistency?
Well, I think that this is a hackneyed phrase, but I've said anybody that can peel potatoes can carve. But some people are better at peeling potatoes than others. So I think they can get a better looking potato at the end. And so I think it's a combination. I think anyone can move along, but there might be limits that some would. Sometimes this style that I am drawn to, this so-called Scandinavian-style flat plane carving, is, and the flat plane, of course, stemming from the fact that I want those big facets to show. I want it to be minimalist in style. And sometimes, if someone is a real perfectionist, that maybe is not their best choice of styles, because it's when to stop. That's a tricky one. I've had people in classes who, I'll have a model standing there and they'll be carving away on theirs, and then put on a loop and pull out from their engineering kit and measure the width of that chip on mine, and they're saying, nuts. I'm wider on that, and that's kind of missing the point of whack, whack, whack. And so, but I think that anyone with practice can move along on that continuum. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Harley,
Yeah.
your first book that you published was Wood Carving, Flat Plane Carving.
Mm-hmm.
I used it as a textbook. You had Emma and Oscar in the book.
Okay.
And people in my class asked me, how come the hat is so far down over his head? And I think in your explanation was people haven't started to carve eyes yet. And his hands were in his pocket. How come you don't have his hands outside? I said, wait till you get to the point of carving a hand. Hands in the pocket. And that book was a great lesson for all my students here at the Institute.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And we do have one last question from the other room, from Henry, age 12. How long does it take you to carve a figure?
It depends on obviously it depends on the figure, Henry, if you're listening. But if after a person has carved quite a few of them, it goes faster. There's no question about that. I will say that a small figure that when I was first getting going, it probably took me a few days, because I spent a lot of time kind of worrying the wood off. I didn't know where to make that first cut, because I thought, if I do this, then there goes his whole shoulder. And now, when the whole shoulder goes, and I think, Oh, that's no problem. I just take off the other shoulder too, and then it matches. And so if a person can sort of make mid-course corrections, and that comes with having just made lots of mid-course corrections. But I think that, so what took me several days to do when I first got going, it probably isn't more than a few hours now.
One Oscar carved in 22 minutes in front of one of your classes that I was privileged to attend. You went just to show us one Oscar.
Okay.
Done in 22 minutes. We timed it.
It must have been a soft piece of wood. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Let's thank Harley again. Thank you, Harley.